You are the Distinguished Fellow at the Chatham House. Can there be managed competition between East and West, given the geopolitics right now?
Well, Stephen, thanks for the opportunity. And if you talk about managed competition between East and West, I think you mean managed competition between the US and China, or maybe the US and Europe and China. Yes, I think it is possible. Yeah. But we are in a very bumpy period where the total scale and direction of this relationship has not yet been designed and known. I think when Jake Sullivan, the U.S. National Security Advisor, famously described wanting to create a small yard with a high fence, nearly 2 years ago now, the idea then was to try to have a relatively limited form of competition, or limited form of protection, and therefore manage competition. But since then we've seen almost an accidental expansion into areas of biotechnology. It was meant to be just quantum, AI, semiconductors. Now it's biotech, it's aspect of electric vehicles. People are not quite sure. Would it be cloud computing? Where do you draw the line between technologies that are really dramatically impactful on security and on the capacity for China to build up its military capability, and where do you not have to worry about it, do general trade?
Right, and on climate change as well. Obviously, a lot has been talked about the overcapacity in new energy vehicles and also batteries, solar and the like, and trade action has been taking place. The Vice Chancellor of Germany is here trying to find some negotiations, obviously, because there could be retaliatory tariffs if the EC goes ahead with its 48% tariff. So I also talked a couple of weeks ago with the Chinese new envoy for climate, and he says the world needs cheaper new energy vehicles. They need these kind of technologies. Where do you weigh in on the world's need, given the climate crisis, for these cheaper technologies versus protecting one's domestic economies, like in Germany and the United States?
Well, in a democracy, Germany is a democracy, obviously, and it's a democracy that's done very well out of a very successful car industry. And they saw what happened to the German solar panel industry about 20 years. Wiped out by a very laissez-faire approach. It would be good in general for the economy. Angela Merkel, in fact, overrode the European Commission at that point to try to keep that trade open, and look at the impact it had. You've also got this connection where it's so different right now. Europeans look at their experience of depending on Russia for fossil fuels and getting it cheap and doing well. They don't want to repeat that mistake and then depend on China, let's say, for batteries, imported batteries at least, and then find that their new energy transition is reliant on a different country. They can squeeze prices. So there's a geopolitical dimension or a geoeconomic dimension on top of simple things of not wanting to see their position at the top of the car industry knocked out.
Now, the book that you just published in March is called The New Cold War, How the Contest Between the U.S. and China Will Shape Our Century. It's a different Cold War, you argue, than the Soviet versus U.S., the two blocs. There are other nations, non-aligned nations perhaps, with healthy GDPs that also want to come to the table with a voice. Yeah. The Global South, for example. Yeah. They're represented here. How does that change the dynamic?
Look, I think the two biggest changes from the last Cold War with this Cold War, and I think we are in one, and we're certainly heading in that direction of getting tighter, is that China relies on a stable world. It relies on engagement in the global economy. So that's one positive. That also gives more power to the Global South. The countries in the Global South are now not just about 65% of world population, they're close to 30% of world GDP. They've got demographic weight and growth still behind them. They've got new technologies coming in, but they're able to triangulate and play one side off the other in this new Cold War. So a country like Indonesia doesn't just say we'll sell our lithium or our cobalt or our nickel to you, other countries. We want you to get involved in the global supply chain, come over here and help us process, in fact, help us build our own cars. So, and each side, if they want to play in Indonesia, need to come in and help them. So you've got in Africa, countries able to play now what was just China's Belt and Road Initiative is now being played off against the G7's Global Partnership on Investment and Infrastructure. So they've got a sort of a clout that they didn't have before. They're not going to be proxies, they're not going to be passengers. And India, I think, is playing this the best.
Does the return of Donald Trump in the White House escalate the presumed, escalation into Cold War version 2?
The people who believe they have a shot at having a seat in his administration, the bulk of them will heat up this Cold War. He himself, I believe, is somebody who's more risk-averse. At least, I mean, who knows? But if I just read how he handled his last term, and you read what his interests are, and his kind of deal-making instincts are not to get trapped in conflict. Certainly, if you're trapped in a war, you lose control as a president. You have to hand it over to your security establishment. So I think while he's going to have advisors who might heat it up, he himself, his instincts will be transactional. What's best for Donald Trump and his power base inside the United States?
Well, the Biden administration likes to say that they're targeting in their export controls and some of these other trade actions only about 4% of overall trade between China and the United States. I mean, it's debatable the level of impact, right? But Donald Trump is talking about across the board 60% tariffs on all Chinese products, not just the new 3 that Xi Jinping is touting. I mean, that is a significant ramp up of protectionism and a trade war.
Absolutely. Look, the EU is negotiating the tariffs that they've announced, whereas Donald Trump is saying that he's just going to impose them. Now, some of this is posturing ahead of the election, and in the end, if that starts to affect inflation, if that starts to affect the cost of living for his voters, you know, he will use that, as he did last time, as a negotiating position. I'm imposing these 60% tariffs, but he'll slap them on to start with, and then try to find some scope to be able to pull back.
How does China's sluggish growth, if you will, play into this discussion? There's been a lot of discussion here in China about the de-dollarization. It hasn't happened. We're in a king dollar right now. And through the pandemic, investment flows, about a third of global investment flows have been with U.S. dollar. No matter how much Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping talk about de-dollarization and changing the landscape, the first big change in 100 years. How do you see it?
De-dollarization of global reserves, practically impossible in the near term, certainly so long as the Communist Party of China wants to hold on to control of the currency and be able to determine where it goes. So if it's not a freely tradable and transferable currency, it's not going to become a global reserve currency of any meaningful level. I think we're at 2.5–3% or something like that of total today. But in trade, we're definitely seeing a lot more use of the RMB in its trade, especially with Russia, where the bulk of its trade is now done in RMB. I think half, roughly now, of all of China's trade is conducted in RMB. So it is being able to create a trading currency, and a trading capability, which then makes it less vulnerable potentially to U.S. sanctions in the future. And you've noticed between Russia and China an effort to designate certain banks that will be disconnected from the SWIFT and the transfer system. China has its own nascent payment system in place, and that gives it room to be able to at least trade with the countries it wants to trade with without them having that fear that they'll get cut out of the global financial system.